Hello, this is Jason from Liberate Raleigh, and this is another Liberate Raleigh video. This is going to be the 6th video in the immigration series, and I'm going to cover a few different topics that I think are pretty fair, have some degree of relation to each other, and many anti-immigration libertarians will bring one or more of these topics up in conjunction to make arguments against free immigration. And those topics are race, IQ, culture, and crime. So I'm going to talk a little bit about culture, what it is here to start with. Culture, at least the way I think about it, is the traditions and the traditions and beliefs of a given group of people, various practices that they may engage in, actions that they do that are common among people within a group, and so on and so forth. So I think that's a fairly reasonable and accepted definition of what a culture is. Sometimes they fall along ethnic lines or racial lines, but there's really any number of different ways, any number of different borders as far as what delineates the being within the culture and outside of the culture. For example, there's a comic book culture, so people that read comic books and are into superheroes and so on and so forth. There's a particular subculture devoted to that. So that's pretty much what culture is. So with relation to immigration, what people will say is they want to restrict immigration in order to manipulate the culture within the country. So there's an important point to bring up immediately, and that's there is no right to culture. Nobody has a right to live within a given culture. What they have rights to, and this goes back to my Foundations of Anarchism series of videos where I outline libertarian rights. Libertarian rights are self-ownership and property which has been homesteaded or acquired via voluntary transactions or gift. So you don't have a right to live within a certain culture and be surrounded by people who engage in certain particular actions. What that would mean to have a right to culture would be that you can force your neighbor through the use of violence to act in a certain way. So given that you own yourself and you own you own property, you can implement a particular culture in any way that you wish on your property with things that you own and with obviously your body. Now, culture is typically a social endeavor, so if you want to get together with a group of people and execute certain actions or traditions or customs or whatever it is that you're into, then you can do that by coordinating your actions with other people, or pooling resources, or working in conjunction with various resources and coordinating them, as long as it's on the property owned by you and those other people. You cannot extend that to property owned by other people through the use of force. So it's important to remember that there is no right here that you can use to force a particular culture upon other people. The only thing that you can use violence for is self-defense. So what does it mean to make reference to some right to culture, or to say that, well, I want to restrict immigration because I want to implement a certain culture within the country? What that means is that you want to enforce your preferred set of preferences upon other people. You want to take your cultural preferences and use violence to force other people to live within the culture that you prefer by violating their rights to property. and their rights to self-ownership. So the changing culture in this sense, when you do this, and I've made reference to this in previous videos, you can't make the welfare argument for this. You can't say, well, this culture is better because more people will be happier, or it'll be better because it'll increase utility. You can't simply make that argument, because when you use violence to enforce the culture on unwilling participants, and obviously if they were willing, you wouldn't need to use force to begin with, you have involuntary transactions in that people are not freely choosing to engage in this culture. So this violates Pareto optimality in that people do not, Pareto optimality is two people have a net utility gain without forcing a utility loss on potential utility loss on somebody else. Actually, I may be misremembering Pareto optimality, but the point is, I may have to look that up afterwards. But the bottom line is, you cannot make the case that there is a utility or welfare increase because you are forcing your culture on other people. That simply does not follow. The only way that utility and welfare increases occur is through free and voluntary transactions, which forcing a culture on another people would entail. So you cannot make that case. And it's what it comes down to is a violation of people's rights, and ultimately, I mean, it's criminal activity to force your culture on other people. So you cannot make the case on utilitarian slash welfare grounds, and obviously it violates self-ownership and private property, and in that sense is criminal. So there's another line of argumentation that anti-immigration libertarians will make when they want to reference culture as a reason for preventing immigration, and that's that they do it for tactical or strategic reasons in order to make the population more conducive to accepting libertarian principles. Christopher Cantwell has, I've read something from him where he sort of makes mention of this, at least implicitly. He once said that, well, if you let people from, say, I believe the country he used was Afghanistan, if you allow unlimited immigration from, say, Afghanistan, what you end up with is a country that turns into Afghanistan. So the argument is, it's usually made with reference to people from very different cultures that maybe have less of a grounding in the libertarian tradition, and also from people that are coming from oppressive regimes. Usually it's made in reference to Middle Eastern countries that may be extremely oppressive. So, and again, that goes back to Cantwell's mentioning of Afghanistan. Well, first of all, mathematically speaking, this doesn't follow. When you allow immigration from one country to another, you're allowing, what would happen is a subset of the population from the other country comes into this country. So it does not necessarily follow that this subset of people will have the same beliefs or cultural practices of the ruling class, and the source of the oppression is from the ruling class in this case. Typically, they may also have support from the general population, at least in some ways, but again, we're talking about a subset of people coming from one country to another. So you can't make the argument from necessity that, well, if you just allow immigration, unlimited immigration from, say, Afghanistan to the United States, you're going to turn the United States into Afghanistan, because people, this subset may or may not have some, none, all. It can't be said with any certainty which of the cultural preferences and norms they will carry with them into, say, in this case, the United States. The other thing is, let's say, so you have a country in the Middle East, and again, Afghanistan is the example used here. So you have this country, and again, we'll say it's oppressive. So they have these cultural norms that are being forced upon them via the political process. Now, these people are, because they're trying to immigrate into the country, you automatically know that they're not happy in this other country. So they're trying to get away from this oppression, or at least that's one of the reasons that they're trying to get away from this oppression. They may just be saying, well, with a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, it's because the U.S. has, and other, not just the U.S., but other countries have engaged in warfare in their area, and they're just trying to get away from the destruction and carnage. But again, in many instances, they're also trying to get away from the oppressive regimes that they live under. And so in this case, this might make them more conducive to libertarian principles. When you go to someone like this, especially if you allow free immigration into the country. So you have people within this country voluntarily choosing to help people from Afghanistan. Again, I'm just using Afghanistan as an example because it was mentioned by Cantwell. So you have people acting compassionately and virtuously to assist these people to come to the United States and make a better life. This might make them more conducive to accepting the cultural norms that brought about this compassion and virtue. And again, they live under oppressive regimes. They are, at least in some instances, leaving to get away from these oppressive regimes. So again, why would they want to instill the oppressive regime in their new country when they didn't like it in the old country? And again, I can't, and nobody can do this. Nobody can speak with certainty about the particular people that might immigrate from one country to another, which is kind of the point. We don't know. And we don't know what their cultural beliefs will be once they come to the new country and live here and are subject to other cultural influences. They might be less conducive to accepting libertarian principles, or they might be more. We don't know. And again, as with many arguments against immigration, these things apply to people within the country, domestic citizens within the country. So if you're opening up, restricting free association and movement of people on the grounds that their movement may or may not make the domestic population more or less willing to accept libertarian principles, then you must also accept a consequence of this argument is that you want the government to manipulate the movement of people within the country and perhaps deport people. And again, since virtually everybody rejects the, well, put this another way, virtually everybody accepts that the government should exist, that means that you should probably deport virtually everybody within the country. Now, maybe some other libertarians are comfortable with the government having this power implicitly via the arguments just made. I am not. And again, you're violating free movement and free association, which is a consequence of self-ownership and private property ownership. And again, another problem here is that, and this relates to the fact that these things are in fact criminal activity to prevent people freely moving and associating with others. This is, again, criminal activity, and this is important to understand, because if you're making the argument that immigration should be restricted because by allowing free immigration into the country, you are making the domestic population less likely to accept libertarian principles. Well, let's break this down a little bit. In order to implement a restrictive immigration policy, you have to at least convince some of the people that this is the correct policy. And by doing so, you are convincing them of a non-libertarian principle. You are convincing them to reject libertarian principles of self-ownership and private property, because you are arguing against free association and free movement, which again are consequences of self-ownership and private property. You're not allowing people to move given voluntary agreement between consenting persons. So in order to implement this policy, you have to convince the domestic population, in whole or in part, of non-libertarian principles. By doing so, you make the domestic population less libertarian. You make them, by accepting these arguments, they are less likely to accept further immigration principles, because you have argued against libertarian principles. And you have argued against them in such a manner that people have accepted it. So in order to, the reasoning and the strategy and tactic here is self-defeating, on the grounds that by restricting immigration to prevent the domestic population from becoming less likely to accept libertarian principles, you have necessarily made the domestic population less likely to accept libertarian principles. So it doesn't make any sense to utilize this as a strategy or a tactic. The much better strategy is to consistently defend self-ownership and private property, and allow free association among people and a free movement of people who wish to move and engage in voluntary transactions with other people to execute those movements, and voluntary actions of free association. That is the consistent argument and application of libertarian property rights. So the way to make people move people towards becoming more principled libertarians is to be consistent in the arguments and application of those principles, not to compromise for supposedly strategic reasons or short-term gains, so to speak, which again are not short-term gains because you necessarily lose out because people are now less libertarian, and because they have accepted non-libertarian arguments that would seem to me to make them less likely to accept libertarian principles, and you're stepping backwards instead of stepping forwards. So again, the anti-immigration arguments simply don't hold any water. They end up being counter to what the end state goal is, which is full implementation of libertarian property rights. So moving along a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about race and IQ and how it relates here. There are a number of libertarians that will argue against free immigration on the grounds that we should not be allowing people with low IQs into the country. And they usually make these arguments along racial lines, in that people of certain races from particular countries with low average IQs should not be allowed into the country. They often will also make arguments make arguments relating to what is called human biodiversity or race realism, about the genetic and biological necessity of low IQs in certain races. I don't accept those arguments. I'm not going to go in depth into those arguments, because ultimately, with respect to rights and libertarian principles, they really are irrelevant. They seem to be basing them mostly on the ideas that IQ has a biological component to it, and also that there are statistical analyses which show that certain races have lower or higher IQs than other races. And from that, it seems like these are the two main main bits of evidence which are used to support the idea of race realism and human biodiversity. But it's actually, it seems to me to be a non sequitur to take those two things and then therefore conclude that, well, there are biological differences between the races which are causing the differences in the IQ scores. Those 2 points of evidence would be necessary but not sufficient to make that argument. But again, that's my impression of it. I'm not going to go in depth into it, because ultimately the question is irrelevant. And the question is irrelevant because rights are not dependent upon what your IQ score is. Whether you have an IQ score of 70, 130, 50, 150, your rights are the same. You have self-ownership, and you have the right to acquire and own through free and voluntary association, homesteading, and trade property. And there is no rational argument against restricting these rights just simply based on IQ scores. You only have the right to use violence when somebody is engaging in aggression towards you or threatening aggression against you. The fact that somebody has a particular IQ score is not by necessity an aggression against another person. I mean, just saying it out loud is just it just sounds preposterous to even say that, well, since you have an IQ of 75, you're aggressing against me, therefore I get to use violence against you. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So with respect to what your rights are, your IQ score is irrelevant. There's another point here that, this is from that I heard while I was watching a YouTube video by somebody by the name of Jim Jesus, and he was talking about a friend of his, and his friend said that, well, if IQ is the issue here, why all the focus on on country of origin and race? A given race, I mean, you're talking about millions of people. There's going to be some distribution curve of what their IQ scores are, and so there's going to be, and again, if we're talking about tens of millions of people, there's going to be many, many people with high IQ scores. Why not let those people in? What is the reasoning behind it? Behind utilizing race or country of origin? Why not skip the middleman and go straight to, well, if these people were consistent and they were consistent in their principle here of IQ scores being so important, then why not just skip right to, well, everybody has to we want to restrict immigration, we're going to do it by are going to do it by making everybody take an IQ test, and if they score above a certain level, then they get to immigrate into the country. That would seem to be the most principled application of this, but they don't make this. They don't make this case, at least not that I'm aware of. They talk about race realism, human biodiversity, and country of origin and race, and so on and so forth. And they say, well, because you're from a race that has a low average IQ score, then we shouldn't let these people in. So that I don't understand, and I don't want to speculate on the reason why, but it just seems to me to be a very glaring inconsistency in thought not to make that what appears to be a very reasonable outcome as far as what the implementation of the principle should be, but they don't seem to make it. But again, that's mostly beside the point. Well, I don't want to say beside the point, but mostly the problem here is that and I've said this many times, and I'm going to reiterate it here, the restriction of free movement and association of people is a criminal act. So you're engaging in criminal activity to prevent people of a certain IQ score to enter the country. And the reasoning, I should digress here and explain the reasoning behind the IQ scores being so important to these people. People of low IQ scores, according to them, engage in crimes at a higher rate than people with higher IQ scores. So the argument is, in order to reduce the amount of crime, we want to prevent people of certain races who have, on average, lower IQ scores. So the problem here is you're preventing crime by engaging in crime. That again doesn't seem to me to be a very effective way of fighting crime if your argument is that you want to reduce the amount of crime. And again, this also brings up the point that you're preventing crime by aggressing against peaceful people. Not everybody who has a low IQ is going to engage in crime. In fact, if you look at crime rates, probably a very small percentage of people would be engaging in crime. So you're aggressing against a large swath of people on the basis that a very small percentage of them in the future may commit a crime. If you're going to do that, then there is really nobody that you shouldn't just automatically aggress against as soon as you see them, on the grounds that they might commit a crime based on some characteristic that you can see, based on their race, based on where they're from, based on the clothes that they're wearing. You can use pretty much anything to justify aggressing against them. And let's be very clear, if you were saying that it's okay to engage in criminal activity against people based on their IQ score, then what you're saying is, as soon as you see someone, and let's say that, and again, you can't just look at somebody and necessarily know what their IQ is, but let's say you could, as soon as you saw someone that had a low IQ or low enough, you would immediately be justified in attacking them. That is the consequence of the reasoning here. You are allowed to attack them because supposedly it's self-defense. But again, unless they are threatening you with aggression or actually engaging in aggression, you do not have that right. You cannot simply preemptively attack somebody or violate their rights on the grounds that they might in the future violate your rights, even though there is no reason, they have given no threat or indication that they will now or in the future engage in criminal activity towards you. And again, the argument in the implementation of this policy is criminal in that you're violating people's rights, and not only that, you're replacing what would be random private crime with institutionalized crime of the state. which I'm going to get into a little bit later on this video. But this is a very serious problem that, I'm not entirely sure whether this has been, these anti-immigration libertarians have thought this through, but I'm going to engage in some analysis later in this video that is going to look at the institutionalized crime versus private crime. But again, ultimately, your IQ has no bearing on what your rights are. And your IQ, whatever it may be, does not somehow justify being aggressed against or aggressing against other people. You always have your rights as a matter of being a human being. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about IQ and crime and the relation between the two before continuing. The argument here is that, again, people with lower IQs commit crimes at a higher rate, or will commit crimes at a higher rate. So I'm going to explain the reasoning behind this a little bit more. The argument stems from the idea that people with lower IQs have a higher time preference, in that they discount future states of affairs at a higher rate than other people. What that means is that they prefer satisfaction now versus satisfaction in the future, which means that they engage in less forethought and foreplanning for the future. So the reasoning here is, let me explain this in more concrete terms. What it means is that somebody would rather have, say, $100 right now than $110 2 weeks from now, say. They would prefer to have the $100 now as opposed to waiting and having something greater in the future. Whereas a person with greater forethought and a lower time preference would be willing to wait and have the better state of affairs in the future. So how this relates to crime is that somebody who's about to engage in the crime currently, like in the moment when they're about to engage in the crime, what they see is the potential payoff of the crime, which would be immediate, and discount the possibility of being caught and the punishment for that crime, which would come down the road, if at all. So the reasoning is that because of this, because of the low IQ, a person with a lower IQ score, which means that their reasoning abilities are less developed and sharp, and therefore they would have less ability to plan and see patterns and possibilities into the future, and therefore would have a higher time preference, such that they would prefer to have immediate satisfaction versus perhaps a future satisfaction that they're unable to reason and see. Then they are more willing to commit a crime in the future on the grounds that they are much less afraid of, or they give a poor assessment of the possibility of being punished for it in the future. So that's the reasoning behind the whole IQ and crime and how it relates. So there's an issue here, and the issue comes down to, it doesn't necessarily follow. And here, let me explain why this is. The mere fact that somebody may not have the reasoning ability, well, I'm going to put this another way. So just because somebody has a higher IQ does not necessarily mean that they will not engage in this criminal activity. It may, and I'm going to argue does, in many cases, mean that the form of their criminal activity will change. They may not engage in petty random crime like running around and just haphazardly stealing from random people's houses. They may not engage in that sort of particular crime, but perhaps they will use those high IQ abilities and reasoning abilities to engage in well planned out, organized crime. I mean, again, an example would be the mafia. The mafia does not typically engage in just random, willy-nilly crime. They are very well organized, and this is the product of intelligence. It takes a massive amount of intelligence to build an organized criminal activity. So the idea that just because somebody has a lower IQ, they would be more prone to crime, as opposed to somebody with a higher IQ, simply does not follow. And the other problem here is when people talk about crime and crime rates, and this is a particularly egregious oversight with respect to libertarians who are making these arguments against immigration on the grounds of crime and IQ. They neglect state crime. They say, well, we have to prevent this haphazard, random private crime, but because people of lower IQs engage in most of that crime, and they're more likely to engage in that sort of crime. But that's not all the crime that happens in the country. The state is a criminal enterprise that engages in massive criminal activity. So I'm just going to illustrate the difference in magnitude that we're talking about here. I went on the internet, and I tried to Google the total cost of crime in the United States. And if you do this, you'll find a lot of different estimates. But I was trying to find the highest estimate range that I could. And the one that I found, and I'll provide a link to this article. I didn't read the whole article. I was mostly just looking for the highest estimate range that I could find. And this seemed to be, at least this was the highest one that I was able to find. So I will provide that link if you want to, in order to cite and reference where I'm getting these numbers from. So the highest range I could find for the total cost, and this is not just, say, the property value of the theft of private crime. This is an estimate of the total cost of private crime in the United States. The highest range I could find was 2 to 6% of GDP in the United States. So the GDP of the United States is approximately $17 trillion. So 2% of that would be $340 billion. 6% of that would be just over $1 trillion. So here we have an estimate of the cost of private crime in the United States. That ranges from $340 billion to $1 trillion. Let's contrast that with the criminal activity of the government, of the state, which again, the state is a well-organized criminal enterprise that is the direct product of high IQ reasoning and intelligence to plan, organize, coordinate the activity of many people across a large landmass. It is not capable of being created and produced by somebody of low reasoning ability that cannot discount future activities into the present and understand and see those possibilities that may occur in the future. The state as an organized criminal enterprise is thoroughly a product of high intelligence. Could not exist otherwise. Maybe some agents on the lower levels are may have perhaps lower than average IQs, but in order to create and plan out and organize this, definitely this is a high IQ endeavor. So, what is the cost of criminal activity of the state? So, on the one hand, we have private crime, 2 to 6% of US GDP, $340 billion to just over $1 trillion. The state, just through direct monetary theft alone, via taxation, all levels of government within the United States, almost $6 trillion. It's around $6 trillion, federal, state, local level taxation. That is merely the monetary cost of taxation that has been taken from people. Now, some people may object and say, well, we get something from the government. They give us something back. Well, they give us crappy services that may or may not be wanted by people. And a lot of those resources that they steal are used to engage in vast criminal activity, foreign policy endeavors, military, the oppression of domestic rights through, say, drug enforcement, which again, I'm not even taking the cost of those crimes into account. I'm simply looking at the straight taxation cost of the organized intellectual crime of the state. $6 trillion, 6 times the top end of the highest cost range of private crime that I could find. 6 times. So when you say, well, we should prevent immigration on the grounds that we need to reduce because people may engage in private random haphazard crime, which falls into the 2 to 6% of GDP range, what you are doing is taking the systematic institutionalized criminal institution, the government, and giving it more power to engage in criminal activity against the domestic population, which is again at least several times worse from just a straight cost accounting perspective. The lower bound is 6 times worse. And when you look at all of the other stuff, and not even getting into subtle things, just looking at the straight crimes committed against people would be way more than the $6 trillion. Even without getting into the subtle ways that the government costs us via inflation, and by manipulating the free market, the cumulative interest compounding of a higher standard of living, which we are prevented from achieving because we have all these interventions in the free market. When you look at that, I mean, I don't know what the cost accounting would be, but it would be staggeringly more than simply $6 trillion. So what you are saying when you say we should restrict immigration on the grounds that we should restrict immigration on the grounds that we cannot have low IQ populations entering the country because they are more likely to engage in crime, you are saying we should marginally reduce private crime, again, 2 to 6% of GDP, by empowering the ability of the institution of criminal activity known as the government to engage in potentially staggeringly worse crimes against us. So if you're trying to make a practical strategic argument with no reference to the fact that you're violating people's rights, you're simply trying to make a pragmatic argument. Your pragmatic argument fails spectacularly when you look at it. It simply does not follow. You are choosing the far worse devil to give power to than simply accepting free movement and immigration of people into the country. And there's another further problem here. So one of the other things that, let's say, that people with high intelligence can engage in is the ability to engage in more intellectually, well, I don't want to say more intellectual propaganda, but have the ability to engage in more effective propaganda by appealing to people's emotions to justify state action, to justify the crimes of the state. So when the government engages in anti-drug laws or engages in foreign policy endeavors, it is the intellectual ability to craft superficially appealing arguments that are actually completely vacuous, that may appeal to people to get them to accept the crimes, or maybe accept that these things are not crimes. You are further empowering the actions of the government that supposedly you're trying to restrain via restricted immigration. So again, the argument that higher versus lower IQ from a pragmatic standpoint doesn't follow. I mean, if you look at most of the people, like the intelligentsia within the United States, none of them are well, I don't want to say none, but the proportion of them that are thoroughly statist, thoroughly proponents of government action, thoroughly believe in the government and either don't think these things are crimes and engage in very interesting and roundabout ways to justify this criminal activity, it doesn't follow that the raising of the IQ is necessarily of benefit in this sense. You don't necessarily get people that are better at promoting the libertarian principles that you're trying to promote. They may use that higher intelligence against libertarian principles. So the proper and consistent application here, I'm going to keep coming back here, the proper and consistent application, the best strategy from a pragmatic standpoint, is the consistent argument and implementation of the libertarian principles that you wish to implement, that you want to occur. If you want libertarian principles to exist in this country, top to bottom, you must argue them consistently and accept them consistently and implement them consistently, and not give these exceptions, well, except for immigration. Well, we'll just accept it. And you can't make exceptions based on arbitrary IQ levels, because again, from a pragmatic standpoint, it simply doesn't follow. And ultimately what you are doing is you are empowering the institutionalized criminal enterprise of the government, which is staggeringly more dangerous to the domestic population and to yourself and to libertarian principles than all of private crime put together. And another problem, yet another problem with this, you can actually engage in defensive ways, in defensive acts to fight off and prevent private crime. So if somebody tries to break into your house, you can defend yourself against that person. You can use force. And the government will actually, in most cases, allow you to do this. If you look at institutionalized crime of the state, there really is no way to defend yourself from it. You may make some appeals in courts of law, but again, they run the courts of law. They set them up. They run them. You're not going to get very far. You might win the occasional battle there, but you're not going to completely eradicate the system by appealing to its courts. That's simply not going to happen. But the bottom line is, ultimately, you are not permitted to defend yourself as a general rule against systematic crimes by the institution known as the government. And a perfect example of this is, if somebody tries to steal money from you, you are allowed to use force to prevent it. If the government taxes you and utilizes the IRS and other police services to get this money from you, to get these resources from you, you are not permitted to defend yourself. And if you do decide to defend yourself, the amount of force that will be brought to bear upon you is orders of magnitude more than any private criminal who probably is acting alone, or if they're acting alone, if they're not acting alone, probably in conjunction with a few other people. And even if we take it to organized crime, organized mobs and criminal enterprises are a joke as far as size and scope compared to the government. The government is far greater. So ultimately, you are trying to reduce criminal activity that you actually have a realistic chance of defending yourself from by empowering and promoting the institution that you have virtually zero ability to protect yourself against. The tax man comes calling. It's ultimately pay or die. If you resist, ultimately, if you continuously resist, force will be brought to bear against you, and you can potentially lose your life depending on how far you take it. So again, if you're trying to make a pragmatic argument against immigration on these grounds, it simply doesn't work. You're making things far worse. If you're basing these IQ and crime objections to free immigration. So ultimately, again, crime doesn't pay. So this is the pretty much what I wanted to cover for the 6th video. I hope I covered everything that needed to be covered here. There's a lot of different arguments relating to these different topics that I brought up here. I was hoping to get a lot of the main ones, but there's so many of them out there. I knew I was going to have no way of addressing everything. I just hope that this was enough to hit the high points and yeah, pretty much hit the high points. So again, this is the 6th video in the immigration series from Liberate Raleigh, covering race, IQ, culture, and crime. I hope it was interesting and informative, and I will see you guys in the next video. Have a great day.